Okay. So, welcome everyone to episode 4 of Revisioning Democracy. Opus Dei, Radical Catholics, Dark Money, with journalist Gareth Gore and co-hosts Anne-Christine Tedeschi and Sally O'Driscoll, who's filling in for J.A. Walker, who was not able to attend tonight. Thanks for joining us. My name is Greg Newton. I'm the co-founder, along with my partner, Donnie Jokum, of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division. And the Bureau is an independent queer bookstore that has been in existence since 2012 and has been here at the center since 2014. Our regular bookstore hours are Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. And then we often stay open later when we have events. And if you're not on our email list already and you would like to be, you can sign up for that at the back of the room, or for those of you watching online, you can go to bgsqd.com and you'll get the newsletter every other Monday about our many upcoming events. We have a very busy calendar. So before we get started, I wanted to, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement. It's open, just push. No? Okay, sorry. It's open, I swear. So yeah, before we get started, I wanted to read a land acknowledgement and a statement of solidarity with the Palestinian people. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to join, who wish to acknowledge, rather, the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City. We have been and continue to be despised by many, even our own parents, families, and communities of origin. This reality evokes in many of us a deep empathy with others who are likewise seen not as fully human, but as problems to be solved, questions for which the answer is ultimately elimination and erasure. As we watch the ongoing genocide of Palestinians by the State of Israel, carried out with the full support of our government and funded by our tax dollars, we witness the inevitable results of defining a people solely as a threat to the safety and well-being of those deemed inherently worthy of life. This horror compels us to speak out, not only against the current bombardment and siege of Gaza by the State of Israel, but against the historical and ongoing violent displacement of Palestinians by Zionists and the conditions of occupation and apartheid under which Palestinians have been forced to live for over 75 years. In our longing for a very different reality, we draw inspiration from the words of Jose Esteban Munoz. Queerness is essentially about a rejection of the here and now and an insistence on potentiality or concrete possibility of another world. With that, I will turn it over to Anne-Christine and Sally, and we will get started.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Greg. And again, as always, thank you to the Bureau for hosting us. This is a twice monthly podcast, and we'll be having another one coming up on October 25th. And we have really kept our focus in much of this discussion so far on Project 2025. And just to say, for those of you who are listening virtually, we welcome you to the conversation, those of you who are in the room with us. And today is going to be a great conversation. I've been looking forward to it for quite some time. And we're going to be talking about Opus Dei, which is a branch of the Catholic Church, and all about its connections to not only Project 2025, which is just a tangent, but also how it came to be so involved, but so not so well known in terms of the United States and its domestic policy, and currently, of course, the kind of right-wing politics that we've been seeing that are giving us the picture we have today, just 3 weeks away from our election. So our guest today is Gareth Gore, and our subject is Opus Dei, Radical Catholics, Dark Money, and Project 2025. And I just want to welcome Gareth, who's in England right now. It's late for him, and really appreciate you making yourself available. We're going to be talking about Gareth's first book, which is right here. It's called Opus, beautifully designed, out by Simon & Schuster, just came out on the 1st of October. I urge you to get it. It's a wonderful read. It's a very narrative book, even though it's really an expose of very deep financial investigative journalism. It really reads like a novel. And I think that's because there's a lot of stories to be told, and that really is very much what Gareth has done. So first, I just want to introduce Gareth a little bit, which is that Gareth is a financial journalist and editor with close ties to 2 decades of experience, excuse me, who's reported from over 25 countries and covered some of the biggest financial stories. He's based in London, and his writing has been published by Bloomberg, Thomson Reuters, and International Financing Review. He's the host of The Syndicate, which tells the behind-the-scenes stories of the biggest financial deals in history. And that is very much how I think he entered into the Opus Dei story, and we'll be hearing about that. So first of all, I want to welcome you, Gareth. Thanks so much for joining us.
And Sally, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, I'm not actually there, but I apologize for not being there in person, but it's been a busy week of promoting the book in Spain. But it's great to join you over video.
And just to say that unfortunately, we're missing J.W. Walker, who's our co-host. He is not feeling well today, but he has read the book, and I know that he wishes he was here because he's got so many questions as well, I'm sure, for you. So I just really want to start with, before we go into the book itself, just talk about how is it that you came to the subject here of doing a book about not so well-known branch of the Catholic Church, and kind of a little bit about when you began that work. How long ago was it, and when did you begin writing it?
So I came to this story completely by accident. I'm a financial journalist, as we were saying. I knew next to nothing about Opus Dei when I first came into this story in 2019. So in 2019, I went to spend some time in Spain. 2 years earlier, a bank in Spain had collapsed, and I'd kind of covered it from London and written a bit about it, and just kind of, I guess, I'd written about this bank collapse through the lens of every other bank collapse that I'd covered throughout my career. I assumed it was just a story of a bunch of executives who had allowed things to get out of control, and it had all come kind of crashing down. The same story that we've seen countless times, certainly in Europe, also in the US, in the past couple of decades, and further back as well. But when I got to Spain in 2019, I noticed in the newspapers that there were a bunch of disgruntled investors and bondholders who were trying to get their money back. You know, they'd seen their investments in this supposedly really strong institution just vanish, turn to dust overnight. They'd lost, there were investors who had lost billions of euros, billions of dollars, and they were fighting in the courts to get their money back. And so initially I thought, hey, maybe there's a story here. So I started to meet with a lot of these disgruntled investors and bondholders who were super happy to talk to me because, here was an international journalist who kind of, knew the world of finance and who was willing to write about their fight. But there was one kind of gaping hole. There was this group of investors called the Syndicate, who were the biggest, was kind of collectively the biggest shareholder in the bank when it collapsed. They owned about 10% of the bank, which at its peak was a stake worth about $2 billion. And I thought, how odd that these guys just seem to have disappeared from the scene. And I kind of dug more and more into it and started to find a few connections between some of the companies that were at the heart of this group called the Syndicate and Opus Dei initiatives around the world. And I kind of thought that was curious, but didn't think too much of it. But then my lucky break came when I met the former chairman of the bank a few weeks later. And
I want to hear about the story, but let's give people who haven't heard it all a little background too, because, you know, I think many people may have heard about Opus Dei. I happen to have gone to 12 years of Catholic school, so I certainly was familiar with the name, but I think in the popular world out there, there still is more of an association maybe with the very entertaining but very hyped movie, The Da Vinci Codes, you know, in which kind of a homicidal albino monk goes on a rampage, and you're seeing a lot of kind of you know, Cloak and Dagger with Tom Hanks, you know, thriller about this rather secretive cult. And I don't think that there's been so much more. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that as you talk about a lot in the book, Opus Dei has really taken pains and consistently over many, many decades now to really keep its operations, its membership, the way it kind of moves money and influence around, even its goals, secret. So I want to talk about Opus Dei and just tell me a little bit. Before you began, you say you didn't really know anything about Opus Dei. Did you have, you know, what was your sense of it, if anything?
I kind of knew a tiny bit about it, but really kind of tangentially. So my partner is Spanish, and Opus Dei is huge in Spain. So I guess over the years I might have heard the name Opus Dei kind of mentioned, dropped into conversation here and there, but I certainly hadn't knowingly known any members or didn't really know what the practices were. I think probably my knowledge was I guess through the Da Vinci Code. I probably watched the Da Vinci Code on like an airplane one day or something. Or, you know, like it wasn't the kind of film I would normally seek out, but you know, when you're flicking through the films on a long flight or something, it's probably something I watched. I certainly hadn't read the book. I mean, I read the book as part of my research for, I mean, I just wanted to, because there's a chapter of the book where I talk about how Opus Dei tackles the, you know, the release of the Da Vinci Code. So I felt I needed to read it. And, you know, it's kind of, I guess it's enjoyable, but it's fiction. And
we're going to talk about how it does and doesn't match the fiction. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk about with you today is that here we are in the United States, and we're dealing with Project 2025, which is people know as a conservative blueprint to really completely remake the American system of government. It's definitely populist, it's definitely far right, but it advances an agenda of Christian nationalism. And the reason I'm even having this conversation with you, I think probably like you, Gareth, that's something. The minute I kind of came across Opus Dei, I started pulling on that string. And the more you pull on that string, the more rabbit holes appear that you kind of go down and you start making these incredible connections. So for me, it was really not looking for anything, but discovering, quite to my surprise, a number of high-level people associated with Project 2025, the architects, people who are running a lot of the advisory groups, some of whom are open members of Opus Dei, some of whom are affiliates. And so I just thought that this was startling, in part because I always associated the Christian nationalist movement in the US more with the Protestant movement, you know. And so it's been very interesting to me to see the emergence of a pretty high-powered, very well-funded group of radical Catholics at the helm of this movement, which is essentially representing the Republican Party agenda. So that's why I came into it. But let's just go ahead and talk about Opus Dei. I know you've been probably practicing this, so just give us a short primer on what is and isn't Opus Dei.
Okay, so Opus Dei was founded by a Spanish priest called José María Escriba in 1928. And Escriba basically told people that he'd received this vision from God for a new kind of organization for serious Catholics who wanted to basically live out their faith, you know, a little more intensely without becoming priests or nuns. And so he developed this organization, which initially had kind of rather, I guess, quite a benign and quite laudable philosophy of just helping ordinary Catholics to strive for perfection, to offer up everything they were doing in their lives, in their daily jobs or in their home lives, to offer it up to God by striving for this perfection. But you've got to look at the development of Opus Dei against the socio-political backdrop. So this is Spain in its formative years were in Spain in the early 1930s. This was a country, a deeply divided society, a country on the brink of civil war. Workers had risen up, overthrown the monarchy. They were fighting for their rights, and they were beginning to ask questions about the church and beginning to turn their backs on the church. So this is when Opus Dei is in its infancy, and Escribá sees what's happening around him, and he's horrified. So what he does is he begins to transform the organization, and it very rapidly takes on a kind of militant, reactionary, and deeply political hue. So he starts to pen all of these documents. So this initial quite benign vision takes on quite a kind of dark militaristic undertone. So he starts talking about how his followers, and he has very few at this stage, how his followers are part of this guerrilla army who are tasked with infiltrating every element of society, government, the judiciary, education, the media, business, and using their positions there to, in his words, to gather information on the enemies of Christ, and also to follow the orders of Christ, and as part of this great re-Christianization of the world that he envisaged.
So today, I mean, just to give context for people listening, again, they don't really know. Right now, Opus Dei is a global behemoth, right? It has billions of dollars. It has chapters all over the world. It has had hundreds of foundations in the United States. It runs schools. There's a big building up here on 34th Street in Manhattan. It has its headquarters in Washington, the Catholic Information Center. It also has been occupying a very particular place in the structures of the church, both independent, but at the same time under the Vatican. But I think the reason that we're here today is because you began with a financial investigation, and I want to talk about how you did it, but also because of your conclusions. I mean, you're not the first one, but you really give us a lot of details. Some of the things that you accuse in your book and give a lot of evidence for are a series of both criminal and kind of human crimes. I mean, they include, as a church, predatory recruitment techniques of members, psychological abuse, a consistent grooming and isolating of young people, control over their daily lives, in many cases, in a kind of really well-organized, systemic recruitment that enslaved, as you put it, young women in particular, so that they were working 10, 12 hours a day, turning all their money over to this institution, not having any liberty to have access to their money, having their Social Security payments, et cetera, taken. And then there's other things, we have these kind of salacious moments of like what we call, the silice, which is this corporal mortification where you see I think in the Da Vinci Code, which is a practice of inflicting a little bit of pain and drawing a little blood, which practitioners are supposed to do. And why that gets attention, much more seriously, you have, as I said it, what you call human trafficking. And then you have the financial fraud you describe, which is billions of dollars. And then the piece that comes to what we're talking about today, which is money laundering and money passing between members of Opus Dei institutions that are not so well known and right-wing institutions and parties in Europe, now in the United States. And it's kind of like where Escribá began in 1928 and where we are today. I mean, I'm sure he couldn't have imagined it, but he really has, or Opus Dei seems to have, infiltrated all these different echelons of society.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's by design as well. I mean, so Escribá, right from the very early days, decided that the organization was going to target the elites, because in order to change society, you have to target and entice into your membership those people who are either already in positions of power, able to kind of push through the changes you want, or people who are tomorrow's elite. So this is why, they have a huge presence on Ivy League universities in the US. And, they're basically present on the campuses of every major university across the world. So, yeah, it's absolutely by design. And, coming back to the US politics, I mean, they've really pumped resources into expanding in Washington, D.C. in particular over the past 50, 60 years. And they've done it extremely successfully. I'm sure we'll move on to talk about how they've done that more precisely a little bit later. But yeah, it's been very successful.
Before you move on from that, could you, for Americans who don't understand, who had never heard of Opus Dei, who never saw it as part of public life, could you explain a little bit how Opus Dei came so quickly to infiltrate American organizations and have that much influence? And tell us a little bit more about what that influence has done in the US.
So I think there were a number of so Opus Dei has been present in the US since the late 1940s. And at least initially, it was kind of concentrated in the cities with large Catholic populations. So Chicago, Boston were obvious examples. But because the organization aspired to infiltrate the corridors of power, by the early 50s already, it was making inroads into Washington. In fact, it had all of these grand plans. It wanted to set up a university in Washington, D.C., and they actually opened this institute in the late 50s. It was a complete flop, so they ended up closing it down. But already that gives you kind of some kind of insight into the kinds of ambitions they had for DC as a political center. I think the real turning point for Opus Dei in the US was in the 80s. So this was a time when the US Catholic Church was deeply divided. You had a lot of outspoken progressive bishops who were using their positions of influence to basically call out the Reagan administration for many of the policies that it had, especially in places like Central America, where many left-leaning priests were being targeted by the various military regimes it was supporting there. And this created a huge kind of schism, you might say, within the US church. And Opus Dei really tapped into this. So it really sought to position itself to take advantage of that schism and to ally itself with, I guess, the conservative wing of the US Catholic Church. It had been given all of these extra powers by John Paul II. And, so these two things, the extra powers from John Paul II and a deeply divided US church, allowed it to really position itself to financially benefit and grow its membership in the US.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between Opus Dei and, one of the things that I think people don't know about unless they've really studied it is that Opus Dei really, from the beginning, as Gloria, opened itself up to lay people. So the difference really is that not only lay people, married people, so that, like, for example, the Protestant wing that we're seeing now growing so much, the New Apostolic Reformation, where people think of themselves as living apostles, in many ways, people who become members, this category called supernumeraries and numeraries, these individuals who take different commitments and make different commitments, are able to live their lives in an ordinary way, some of them, or others are members. And so they're sort of encouraged to not to be priests necessarily. There's only a very small number who are priests, but really the body of them are people who are working and then, of course, turning over their finances and influencing people in all these spheres. I'm curious to know, like, you met hundreds of people in the research for this book. You've talked to a lot of former Opus Dei people, current members of Opus Dei. Can you tell us just sort of I'm curious about your sense of like, maybe the variance of their opinions about Opus Dei. Some people must love it. They've gotten fellowship from it. They've gotten a spiritual home from it. It's never kind of a black and white. It's not a Da Vinci Code, as you say. It's not a fiction. It's a real, faith for these folk, a living faith.
Yeah, I think it's important as well to state that this is an expose of the organization. The book is not a judgment on Opus Dei members. I believe the vast majority of Opus Dei members are completely unaware of the abuse and manipulation that is going on within the organization, sometimes against themselves without them even knowing. Opus Dei habitually kind of abuses confession and spiritual guidance sessions to collect information on its members. I think a lot of the membership is completely unaware of some of these practices. But I think the appeal of Opus Dei is that basically the selling point is that, look, we can help you to become a higher level of Catholic. You know, if you want to be really serious about your faith, we can help you achieve that. You don't need to become a priest or a nun. We'll show you how to do it, you know, as you are as a doctor or an academic or a journalist or whatever. We're going to help you to do it. And you know, I think people look to it as this kind of elite organization, this extremely serious and devout organization, and it's helped by the fact that this is an organization that is approved of by the church, that has the legitimacy of the church behind it. So what happens is ordinary Catholics who are just searching for something a bit more deeper, they see Opus Dei and they think, well, what could possibly be wrong with this movement? If it's been approved by the Vatican, that must, you know, if it's got the seal of approval, then that must be a good thing. And, you know, so they basically drop their guard and allow themselves to be reeled in by this message. And the message is a front, and it's a way of recruiting people into the movement. What most members don't realize is that there's this real horrible underbelly of human trafficking, abuse, manipulation, prescription drugs like pushed onto members. It's an organization that's absolutely riddled with huge problems.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that has emerged, and you know, it did start in the 30s and 40s. You detail this in the book when you talk about kind of the beginning of Escriva's you know, vision. He turned, you know, his ideas into something called the Way, and then now it's known as the Work, which is the kind of code for the beliefs of the people who are ascribing to Opus Dei. But it really has emerged also as, and from the beginning, not just in Spain, but in other places, as a kind of, you know, refuge from modernism, as a refuge against the changes of the world. It became a very anti-democratic institution pretty early on and has remained so. So everywhere you're looking at Opus Dei around the world, it's begun to be very linked, not just with kind of a sense of conservative faith, but politically with a kind of anti-modernism, and you know, which is we're seeing here in the US too. I mean, if you look at it's fascinating to me to see the parallels now. For example, I look a lot at the NAR, which is the New Apostolic Reformation. A lot of these people, whether you're talking about J.D. Vance or these folks, they're very focused on the idea of going back to the early Christianity. They're not talking about, you know, modern Christianity. They're talking about, you know, early 17th, 18th, earlier Christianity. They want the laws of our United States to be based on these early interpretations of the Bible. They talk about Christendom. And we find the same thing in Opus Dei. It's this desire to be kind of shielded from a modern world. And with it comes, of course, extreme patriarchy. I mean, you know, the views that they have on women, it doesn't surprise me to hear about trafficking, because it's absolutely establishing that women are not on an equal level with men in their roles in Opus Dei and what they do, what they have access to, et cetera. So I'm just interested in, you know, when you looked into it, I mean, how much is I guess I'm curious to know, like, when you began the financial, you know, expose of it, maybe what were some of the real surprises for you in doing the work? I mean, you kind of went in not knowing and pulling on a string, and then you kind of kept going and meeting people. But what are some of the surprises for you as a researcher in this?
I mean, the biggest shock for me, so as I was saying earlier, when I started pulling at the strands, I started finding links between the bank and Opus Dei. And at first I just thought, well, maybe here was a bank that was just, I don't know, giving, you know, donating to good causes, and it just didn't. But then something happened in the news when I was just starting this project. So initially the book was about the rise and fall of this bank and about the chairman of the bank who was a member of Opus Dei, a Numeri member of Opus Dei. And so the book was kind of coming along, it was about that. But then this story came out of Argentina where 42 former what they call Numeri assistants, these women, this subclass of membership, these women who are basically domestic servants, had come together to formally accuse Opus Dei of having basically entrapped them into lives of servitude. And these women had worked, well, some of them were girls at the time. These girls and women had worked like 14-hour days, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, cut off from their families, not allowed to leave the residence without being accompanied by someone else. Like real horrific.
And no money, not a dime.
And not paid a single penny. So I saw this story coming out of Argentina, and obviously I felt sorry for the women and kind of, like, well, this is a horrendous story, but there seemed to be no real connection to my investigation. But then one day in the archive, I came across these unclassified documents in the archives, this huge pile of papers that didn't seem to fit anywhere else in the archive. And there I found proof that money from the bank had been used to set up not just these schools where these girls were recruited and groomed in Argentina, but a whole network of similar schools all around the world in places like Nigeria, the Philippines, Belgium, Mexico, Bolivia. And it was then that I started to think, wow, this is a big story.
Yeah, it is a big story, and it's still not a story that has hit the headlines. Like your book is part of it, but it's not like the stories of the Catholic Church with sexual abuse, where it took years and years and years and years in a lot of cases to finally really produce an awareness in the great public, and cases and levels of mea culpa from the Vatican, and then et cetera. Instead, what you saw similarly, though, is a pattern of hiding it, including sending anyone who's accused in any kind of way, either disparaging them in the press, defending it. It's going to be interesting to me because really your book is like another chapter of this story. It's like yet another setback for Opus Dei, where there's many setbacks that it has. It kind of gets to a level of getting built up, getting resources, even getting a level of credibility, and suddenly it's hit with a scandal. And there's kind of a continued wave because, in fact, it's the structure of this particular institution. So just fast forward, your book has come out, you've been working on it a while, there've been these articles. Have any of these folks read the book, or you've been in touch with these 43 women? What is their response? Is it still going on now that they're seeking to get compensation?
I mean, just a few days before the book came out, there was some major news out of Argentina. So these women filed their complaint in 2021, I think it was. And investigators there have been very quietly looking into this. Federal prosecutors have been investigating their claims for the past 2 years. And I think it was 2 weeks ago, federal prosecutors basically made an announcement that they were going to file formal accusations against Opus Dei, and in particular against 4 priests who had run Opus Dei in Argentina, that they were filing accusations against them for having trafficked teenage girls and women. So, this is an evolving story. I guess it's going to go, these priests will be brought in and questioned. There's going to be further investigations and there'll be a trial. But I really do, I'm hopeful that this is the start of something bigger. As I was kind of saying just now, I know this is the tip of the iceberg. This is not a problem that's confined to Argentina. There were similar schools all over the world. I've spoken to women who've had almost the exact same experience in other parts of the world. So we're talking here about girls from extremely poor backgrounds who are targeted at the age of 12, 13. They're taken away from their families, promised a better life. They're promising education and chances of a better life. They're taken away to the nearest big city where they're put into an Opus Dei hospitality school, they call them. And once they're there and cut off from the family network, they're basically pushed into joining Opus Dei. And, many of them fall and they join Opus Dei because they're told by the people teaching them who are Opus Dei members that God has chosen them, that it's their vocation to become these domestic servants as part of Opus Dei, that's how they serve God. And if they turn their back on this vocation, they will go to hell, their families will go to hell. It's a real dark, manipulative way of controlling these girls.
I mean, many people have always called, regarded Opus Dei as either a sect or a cult, certainly the way you're describing it. And you do say, in fact, on the top of your book, you say the cult of dark money, human trafficking, and right-wing conspiracies. So clearly you view it that way. But its structure and its methods are not different from the kinds of practices we've seen in other institutions and things that are considered, the isolating of people, where they end up having only these people who they regard as their social spheres, but then actually literally controlling them through money and manipulations and stuff. I mean, I think about it now, I can't really go up to 34th Street without wondering at night, there's probably these young people there working 10 hours a day and sleeping on wooden boards, and they have no idea how to get out of the situation that they're in. So I think there will be investigations. I want to turn now to kind of the connections to what we're seeing here in the United States. And Sally brought it up in terms of the US, but there's an awful lot of people now who are at the pinnacles of power in the United States who are either members of Opus Dei or connected to Opus Dei. And so really this branch of the Catholic Church has managed to become really affiliated with a very right-wing, anti-globalist, nationalistic agenda, very patriarchal. And the other thing is that it also is beginning to really be identified with a kind of current right of Catholicism, or a branch of Catholicism that is very opposed to the current Pope. As you said, it's kind of not just an anti-60s or 70s kind of thing around leftism and 80s. It's now where it's basically affiliated with Benedict. Extremely, like, we're seeing literally the rise up of people who are affiliated with Opus Dei, who are not just kind of taking we don't want to listen to the Pope, or the Pope is kind of a leftist and we don't respect him, but a much more radical view of saying we should be breaking off even from the Catholic Church. We should be, this is what you're seeing on, the sort of Steve Bannon type of rhetoric. And so I'm fascinated now with, how this happened. So let's just start talking about, like, when did this begin? And if we could maybe look at, the 80s into the 90s. And I wanted to run a couple of names by you, because these are some of the early names in terms of people now connected to Project 2025. But what we saw was, we had people who are early on in some of the anti-gay movements, like Louise Tellez, who's with the National Organization of Marriage, and the groups at the UN, which are the CFAM. You began to see also some of the folks that are like the high-level people that we first got our attention in the news, like Bill Barr, Newt Gingrich, Sam Brownback, Larry Kudlow. These are high-level Trump appointees who are also affiliated with, or have openly, acknowledged their connection to Opus Dei. And so we're starting to see that. But how do you see the shift that happened? Where, like, when did Opus Dei really start to get its money and get connected to these emerging right-wing institutions and think tanks?
So I think for many years, Opus Dei tried but largely failed to kind of get its claws into the political scene in Washington, D.C. With one, I guess, major exception that, even in the 80s, it became quite close to Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, and Antonin Scalia was a regular attendee at the Opus Dei retreats outside of Washington. He actually turned to Opus Dei for a recommendation for college for his son, and his specific requirement was that the college that they recommended, that there'd be some Opus Dei presence at the college, so that his son, I guess, could continue to be weaned
And
on
this is the son who's now a priest, right? Who became a priest?
Yes, the son is a priest, and he's not officially part of Opus Dei, but he's he certainly crops up, let's say, at various Opus Dei initiatives. So the real transformational moment, I think, for Opus Dei came in the 90s when it was asked to take over a failing chapel and bookshop called the Catholic Information Center, which for like 40 years or so had been run by the Redemptorists, a small movement, but they basically couldn't pay the bills. And the Archdiocese of Washington was looking for another movement to take over this Catholic chapel and bookstore, and Opus Dei offered to do that. For the first few years, not much happened. It was just, just a little bookshop and chapel. But then a guy called C. John McCloskey, an Opus Dei priest, took over as chaplain there. And this guy had initially been posted to Princeton, where he'd made a lot of enemies for himself. He was preaching this crazy radical Catholicism that had nothing to do with most, everyday Catholicism. And he got a lot of enemies. He was booted out of Princeton, but then he was transferred basically to this Catholic Information Center in Washington. And there he became known as the convert maker because of his success in luring a number of high-profile Washington politicians into Opus Dei, to converting them to Catholicism and converting many of them to Opus Dei. I should add, this guy to begin with, McCloskey, he was a Wall Street trader. And I'm convinced that many of the kind of, he'd cold called clients to try and sell them bonds or stock that the bank was trying to offload. He worked for Merrill Lynch and in New York. And I'm convinced that, that same kind of hothouse selling tactics was ideal to convert people.
We actually have someone in the audience who was his dorm room mate at Columbia, and we were just talking a little bit before. We'll I guess some questions from after. We talked about how CJ was this kind of Southern guy, very very charismatic, and just kind of putting people at ease. I think the charisma is the part. But I think what brings people in is you're talking about people who are seeking maybe company, seeking support, and that as he described it, he was put into a dorm at Columbia which turned out to be an Opus Dei dorm or Opus Dei housing, and was love bombed for a year. I mean, he figured it out and got out, but he was love bombed, and that's very much what you describe, is that people get love bombed to feel like they're getting this extraordinary community, and then of course once they're in, they realize that community is not necessarily as friendly, but they're in it already too deeply. So just in terms of Scalia, I mean, Scalia is obviously, someone we got our attentions on the Supreme Court, but there's actually several members of the Supreme Court who've been affiliated with Opus Dei. We certainly have Clarence Thomas and some others. And we talk about that in our own project, Stop the Coup 2025, which is our campaign to educate people about Project 2025. We have done a lot of reporting on this. But one person in particular really, to me, represents the kind of shift and the standout of the shift to really have more political influence, and that's Leonard Leo. Leonard Leo, as some people know, is radical Catholic activist, as a lawyer, very, very influential, and is credited really with putting at least 5 to 6 of the conservative justices on the Supreme Court, kind of handing over the names to Trump. And you describe this in your book, with the death of Scalia, literally, Leo recognizing, oh, this is my moment. I need to make sure that we get these appointments filled, and just acting very quickly to do this. I mean, this is a really cloak and dagger kind of politics for America. Most Americans are not at all aware that this happened, that this took place. It's very, very extraordinary. But what Leo did was obviously bring in a lot of money and bring in a lot of influence, so that today the Catholic Information Center is no longer a small little bookstore. It's this very much a center of conservatism, a stopping place for a lot of people who are Catholics who want to go and be seen there. It's become a place for a lot of the kind of radical Catholic intellectuals to lecture there. It's not just, the Bill Bars. It's young people go there. It's really become the stepping stone in some cases for people who are seeking to have influence in these corridors of kind of Catholic power. So I'm just curious to know, like, if you can talk about Leonard Leo. I mean, we identified him as someone who is identified with Opus Dei. And as you've said, you try to really pin people down and say, are they or aren't they? Ultimately, it doesn't matter as much, because what matters is what are they doing with their influence or money. So what did Leo do for Opus Dei?
So I mean, their orbits are very clearly entwined. It's still unclear to me today whether Leo kind of sought out Opus Dei, or whether Opus Dei kind of sought out Leo. But Leo has he was brought up Catholic. He was a pretty devout Catholic, and he sent his kids to the Opus Dei school. But I think the turning point was around 2014, when he was asked to join the board of the Catholic Information Center in Washington. And this was a kind of critical juncture, I think, for the CIC. They'd had all of this success, basically recruiting all of these high-flying politicians in Washington with McCloskey. McCloskey got embroiled in a sex scandal and had to basically leave the country for a while, and then had to keep a very low profile when he came back. They paid the victim $1 million for her to keep quiet. And yes, so basically kind of the CIC kind of lost its momentum. But then in the early 2010s, I think the Obama presidency in particular kind of invigorated that whole world, that we need to fight against these crazy progressives. The CIC sought to position itself as a real home for these radical Catholics and for these radical conservatives who had been cast adrift by the Obama landslide victory. And so they invited Leo onto the board, but other people were also invited on too, like Bill Barr was invited in, Pat Cipollone. Up until that point, the board of the CIC had basically just consisted of a few volunteers who'd run the bookshop and the priest, the Opus Dei priest. But there was this big shift in around 2014 where they were bringing in all of these big political hitters. And I think it was a conscious decision. Sorry.
You have Ken Cuccinelli. I mean, some of these people are now authors of Project 2025. That's how they've come to our attention, right? They are putting forward these very extremist agendas for what has now become essentially a policy mandate for the conservative movement, and many people see it as a policy mandate for the Republican Party. So it's really important that we understand what they represent. I mean, the views of members of Opus Dei, as you say, can vary greatly. You've got people who might be in it for all sorts of different reasons. But in terms of its agenda, let's talk a little bit about that. You're a financial journalist. You've looked into some of the money. What are we looking at in terms of Opus Dei and its connections to people like Leonard Leo? Where is the money flowed, and what is it doing, that money?
Well, I mean, we know that so Leonard Leo a few years ago was very fortunate in that he became close to this industrialist guy called Barry Side, I think is how you pronounce it. And Side basically decided to bequeath $1.6 billion to Leo for him to use to fund various political and societal kind of initiatives that he was involved in. So Leo now has this war chest at his disposal. He's used some of that to fund some Opus Dei initiatives. He's very supportive, for example, of Opus Dei's plans to expand its current school network in the US, which at the moment only has a handful of schools in Washington, Chicago, and Boston. But there are plans to expand the Opus Dei school network to 20 other states across the US. So he's very supportive of that. But the ambition of Leo and some of the other Opus Dei acolytes that revolve around the CIC is to basically engineer, to basically take on progressivism, wherever it might have any footing, whether that's in education or the entertainment industry, in the media, in business, like wherever there's any hint of modernism or progressivism.
What they
They
would
try
call
to take-
anti-wokeness, right? Anti-wokeness, anti-diversity, anti-woman, and again, anti-modernism. I mean, I'm very curious also, when I'm looking at it is, you know, in the United States, we have been seeing, obviously some areas that are very similar to Europe, where we see a weaponizing of certain issues that are very much social hot button issues. You have gender, of course, transgender issues. That's kind of the hot one here. You have immigration. And you also have, you know, the LGBTQ issues, but when you look around the world, you're also seeing this agenda, you know, the criminalizing, for example, of LGBTQ issues as the kind of wedge issue. And so I've just been looking to see, like, where do we see the money from the kind of organized radical Catholics and Christians? And we're seeing this in Africa. We're seeing that, you know, some of the US groups that are going over that have been giving the template for the legal changes there, the legal LGBTQ attacks are, you know, groups that are here in the United States and consider the hate groups who are also in that Project 2025 orbit. You know, we're talking about groups like Alliance Defending Freedom. We're talking about CFAM, which I get, you know, is again headed by an Opus Dei member. And what do? They, you know, they're at the United Nations. They've been given a certain amount of credibility. They bring together world leaders, and they're promoting these agendas. So I mean, it's not just domestic agenda, it's also US foreign policy. And this new greatly increased connections between the European far right, including Viktor Orban in Hungary, and, you know, what we call the Christian nationalism in the US, which is, you know, the members of Project 2025, architects of Project 2025, many of whom are, as we know, main authors and architects also of the Trump campaign. They helped to write it, they've created it, they're advancing it. And Sally and I have been working a lot lately on the legal agenda that's being advanced, looking toward the elections in 3 weeks. And that's where we see the money. We see the money going to the legal organizations to advance all of the election integrity core challenges. You know, this is the restricting voter registrations, voter IDs, gerrymandering. So you can really see the money. And, you know, to me, it's just a kind of remarkable that it's not so much about Christianity, and it's very much about a kind of social and anti-democratic agenda.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of these people hide behind their faith or use their faith as a shield so that people can't attack them. I think in the US, especially, there's this fear about challenging anything to do with religion. Which is kind of, you know, I think absolutely people should be free to believe and worship in, you know, whatever, as long as that doesn't infringe on other people's rights. But they should, you know, if you want to believe that, that's fine. But we should be allowed to discuss these things in the press and on TV and in the media. And I just think and they play with that a huge amount. I mean, you know, Linda Lee in particular likes to play the card of, you know, I'm the victim here and everyone's stamping on my freedoms.
Or the Christians are victims, as opposed to, you know, I mean, it's not surprising to see that the people who are trying to really mount a defense of this are, you know, Christians against Christian nationalism, who are saying, you know, our faith is being weaponized, and it's being weaponized to advance an anti-democratic agenda. We have nothing to do with these goals. This has nothing to do with my faith. So I think that's big. I want to give Sally a chance to ask some questions, though, because I know she's been sitting here patiently. Sally.
Well, actually, I'm thinking a lot about the huge and very fast success of Opus Dei in merging this kind of right-wing radical political agenda, religion, and money. We now see, you know, 6 Supreme Court justices in the US. We see an enormous web of influence. And I'm sitting here wondering, right, whether the scandals, for example, will make any difference to that, whether the uncovering of this huge web of dark money will make any difference to people. Do you have any thoughts about how that might play out in the future now that there's being a little visibility?
I guess time will tell. I mean, I think up to now, Opus Dei's strategy has been to, whenever there's been abuses that have come out, or, you know, cases of criminality or whatever in whatever country, it's simply washed its hands and said, oh, it's just a few bad apples, it's nothing to do with us. But I think what the book really tries to expose is how this system, how this is systematic. This is by design. These are not kind of little things that have gone wrong here and there. This is how the system, the whole Opus Dei system has been designed. So I hope that it's going to be more difficult for them to just kind of bat away my book as just a few bad apples or whatever. We will see. I mean, I do know.
You have seen that they've denied it, right? I mean, I saw that there was a letter written by, I think it was an article written by Austin Ruse, who's with CFAM, who's a very notorious anti-gay activist. And I was just very pleased to see that our map of the connections between Project 2025 and Opus Dei was used to illustrate that article. So I felt like a level of success that we had at least gotten their attention, that we're tracking them. But one question I have for you is, we're looking ahead. Let's assume, we don't know what's going to happen with this election, but from your own journalism, what are kind of maybe questions you're asking yourselves, or what is the journalism that needs to be done? What's the advocacy that needs to be done, given where we are now? I mean, I have some ideas about this. I'd love to hear yours.
Well, I mean, for me, I think this is just the start of the story. I mean, so the book obviously starts in Spain with this bank, and it's the big expose of how this bank was the secret cash machine of Opus Dei for many, many years. That they were basically able to siphon off hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to finance this network around the world. And the book also touches on US politics and Opus Dei's expansion in the US. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, like, what I hope, there's only so much that one guy can do. I spent 5 years on this project, and I think I've done a decent job of telling this story. But there's so much more digging, so much more investigation to be done. And what I hope the book does is inspire more investigative journalists to basically dig into Opus Dei's tentacles within their own countries, whether that be in politics or business or whatever. I think there's a lot more to this story that we still don't know.
We're going to be turning to questions in a minute, but I just want to ask one last piece of it, which is the connections between the far right in Europe and the United States. We talked a little bit about this, but our own investigation, my own certainly, shows that there are dark money connections, and certainly influence connections between the far right parties, certainly in Project 2025 people. And we're seeing, the populism we're seeing here in the United States, and we're seeing the same pattern. I've been very interested. So have you looked into Opus Dei's funding of any of the far right parties in Europe? I mean, Vox is in Spain. We see the National Rally in France. And I'm particularly interested also in Viktor Orban, because, many people know this, but the Orban regime has very much, not only is the Orban regime a model for Project 2025 openly and embraced by the Heritage Foundation, which is leading Project 2025, but also the Orban Linked Danube Institute, which is a think tank, which has had a lot of these people like Rod Dreher, who's very close friends with J.D. Vance, and who is, again, a radical Catholic, believes in Christendom. I read his, stuff every so often in the press. I mean, there's very close connections here. And I'm just curious about Opus Dei and, the political agenda that is emerging out of the think tanks in terms of the party. So what's happening in the Europe side of things?
I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I'm not really. You're probably more an expert on that than I am. It's so yeah. I don't know a huge amount about that. Maybe that's for book 2. Although I think I'm a little bit tired of Opus Dei.
Definitely the strings to. There's a lot of strings there, and a lot of connections. Okay, well, we'll do it. But I just want to say that particularly for Hungary, I think it's important to look at and to try to understand where is Opus Dei. There's a lot of connections that we're seeing in terms of the people who are moving between, and to the point where, as we know, like Orban has directly funded institutions like or scholars, or what they call them, so scholars fellows, who are advancing some of the most anti-democratic initiatives in the U.S. We have Chris Rufo, who's the anti-DEI, Rod Dreher himself, who's now actually in Hungary with the Claremont Institute. This is all Opus Dei connected and Opus Dei money. So it is something that we need to look at, because it's directly influencing the policies, and it turns out to be our laws. And so we need to know who's funding this, So I'm going to sort of say, before we turn to questions, anything urgent on your end?
No, let's go to questions first.
Yeah. All right, we'll take some questions. Anyone got a burning question for us on Opus Dei right now?
Well, what's a burning question?
Well, it's burning you up, let me put it that way.
No, not burning me up, burning the country up. That's another
Burning the
story.
country up. Any questions?
First thing I would say to the author, and thank you for your hard work on Opus Dei. Opus Dei, as you had used the turn of phrase, tip of the iceberg.
So
is
let me just
that.
relay your question to those who can hear.
I can hear.
Okay, and to those who are watching.
Sorry.
So thank you to the author and also for pointing out how Opus Dei is only the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, but I'm not gonna finish.
Yeah.
I know.
Pope Francis, first of all, you have to know about Jose Escriva. He was a Francoist and he was a Hitler supporter. So that's part of his story. And it blends in with this extremist Christian nationalist movement. Now, Pope Francis has clipped the wings of Opus Dei back in 2022. So the Catholic Church has been emptied into this rotted husk of extreme right-wing people. And there's also something that you may not be aware about.
Let's just get a translation because we have a virtual audience here, so.
Sure.
So Escriva was a Francoist and a pro-Hitler person.
Yeah.
And so we can see the long thread of anti-democratic fascism. But we also see Pope Francis in 2022, kind of taking some steps against Opus Dei, which has then led
Yeah.
so to a situation that.
And the other thing I would say is things people don't know about that are happening. There's an attorney called Jonathan Mitchell here in the United States who has created something called bounty laws, where if something is considered illegal, for example, people can file suit on their own against these people, kind of like the Castro regime with people who snitched to the Cuban state. But actually, these people can file a lawsuit against you for damages.
So there's a lawyer in the US, Jonathan Mitchell, who has propounded these bounty laws, which allow regular citizens to file lawsuits against anyone who they perceive as breaking the law, which I think fits into something that you said, which was that Opus Dei has more in common with the KGB or the Stasi.
Yeah, I'm interested in that, Gareth. The methods.
And did you want to say anything else?
Yes. The other thing, two things. The diversity, the anti-diversity effort or the anti-woke effort has been successful with certain companies, John Deere, and the most prominent one is Ford Motor Company. And Henry Ford was a rabid Hitler supporter, anti-Semitic. He also ran a factory in Germany for the Hitler regime. And you can see pictures of people, saying Ford equals Hitler. And they still haven't answered the question of whether they use slave labor in their camps. But, you look at a company like Ford and you say, well, why did they sign onto this so quickly when they have this horrific backstory?
So we've already seen the anti-woke or the anti-DEI or the anti-diversity policies taking root. We have John Deere and the Ford Foundation, the Ford Company, already kind of going back to anti-diversity policies. And you pointing out that the Ford himself was a pro-Hitler, opened a factory in Germany, and it's still not clear whether he was using slave labor in that factory.
Yeah, he was also radically anti-Semitic.
Making the connections between the past and the present.
Yeah.
Gareth, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the gentleman in the audience is absolutely right that Escrivá had absolutely no scruples whatsoever about cozying up to the brutal, murderous Franco regime. A regime that killed tens of thousands of its political opponents in peacetime, not during the war, but afterwards. They were cozying up to the Franco regime, and after they had successfully kind of infiltrated the elite in Spain, they went to the Franco regime and said, "Hey, maybe we could do the same with the factory workers and the farmers." And they presented the regime with a proposal to basically go out there and
Opportunists.
indoctrinate, the masses. The Franco regime didn't take them up on the offer, but it showed their willingness to do that. And we've seen it time and time again in places like Chile and Argentina, Opus Dei cozying up to authoritarian dictatorial regimes. And I think a lot of these Opus Dei affiliated figures in Washington today, like Leonard Leo, like Kevin Roberts, they see something similar in Donald Trump. He's a vehicle. They know, as devout Catholics, they, I'm sure, find Donald Trump morally repugnant. And, a lot of the things that he stands for.
Without a spiritual bone in his body, is that just something was said?
But he's
Something.
he's a vehicle through which to drive through their agenda. He's an authoritarian figure who will push Project 2025 through. And so, it's this same attitude of, well, we will hold our noses because this will help us to achieve the greater good.
Yes, yes. Other questions?
I'm the guy who was C.J. McCloskey's classmate at Columbia in 1971.
So wait
Great.
a second, we have a
I probably
question.
have more questions for you than.
Yeah, we can chat offline.
CJ McCluskey's dorm mate at
Yeah,
Columbia.
we lived in the same dorm, and I can tell you, I'm sitting here not so much with questions as I'm nodding my head. Yep, that rings a bell, that rings a bell. I just wanted to confirm a couple of things. In this apartment building in Morningside Heights, which was turned into a residence hall, there were these mysterious ladies who would appear at a certain time and make the beds of all of the boys, because Columbia was an all-male institution at the time, and it was strictly vital that all the males had to be off the floor when these ladies, who I assumed were American Hispanics, but for all I know, they could have been imported from elsewhere. We never had any contact with them other than, oh my God, I went on the floor when the ladies went, we had to get off the floor.
So here's a confirmation of one part of what Gareth has told us, which is strange cohorts of women silently coming in and cleaning the dorms only when the men
Only men had
left.
to be off the floor.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. One thing, we're talking about a period 1971 to 72, when I was not aware of any explicitly political agenda. But what I wanted to tell, this is a little detail which I don't think I've heard, that there was a problem with the intellectual mission of Columbia College. Columbia had some humanities classes that they took very, very seriously, during which we read philosophers who were on the index of Catholic books.
Okay,
And
so here we have a point to be made that Columbia College humanities courses had on the curriculum books that were on the Catholic index were not being read.
Hegel, Kant, great
Hegel,
names.
Kant.
Yeah, and just what I wanted to point
The
out is,
existentialists.
yeah, the Opus Dei priest who was in charge would tell the Opus Dei members, oh, don't read those books, but rather read Father Copleston's History of Philosophy. Instead of reading the passages from Hegel, read what Father Copleston said, and that'll prepare you well.
So the Opus Dei priest at Columbia told the Opus Dei members not to read those books on the index, but instead to read another Catholic priest's summary of them.
Yeah, and
An
that actually,
expurgated summary.
that led to the downfall of this particular residence house getting an approval from Columbia. Once the Columbia officials heard about it, they said, that's it for you guys.
Okay, so then that dorm was no longer accepted by
Yeah.
Columbia when that was
But
discovered.
we can talk offline.
But I think what they've done is very much, you're talking about the CIC, where in these last years, we have seen a tremendous increase in the focus on Catholic intellectualism and the arguments that we're seeing, this kind of antidote, all of the wokeism. I mean, it's like there's lectures every single week at the CIC on anti-wokeism, on how you mobilize against transgender people, how to push a pro-family agenda. I mean, it's almost explicitly political, but done through the lens of this is the way in which to advance a more Catholic agenda for those of you who are seeking to have a more pure life. So it's interesting to me that it's not really hiding its political ambitions, at least at a place like the CIC in public lectures, or the Claremont Institute, or the Cato Institute, or I mean, other types of right-wing affiliated institutions that get funded by, not just the people in Project 2025, but in some cases directly by, Opus Dei, or very affiliated with the institutions of the Catholic Church that are, that have a well-regarded reputation. They kind of give the Opus Dei still is imprimatur of authority and legality.
And also what's going on at the CIC is the complete opposite of what Pope Francis has asked for. So after the 2020 US election, Pope Francis came out and said, right, we've had all of these divisions, now is the time for reconciliation. But how did the CIC react to that appeal from the Pope? It decided that it was time to become not a platform for reconciliation, but a platform for really fueling the divisions in society. So it became a platform for people who were fueling the culture wars and talking about many of those things that you were talking about there. So just come back to what the gentleman in the audience was saying, and please, I'd love to speak to him. Please pass on my details or get his details and pass them to me. I'd love to talk more to him. But yes, I mean, Morningside Heights actually features in the book. I'm not sure if he's read it or not, but it was this flagship student residence that they set up at Columbia, but where there was all kinds of trouble. And in the end, the university basically pulled the plug and they had to close it down. I have a question for the guy. I mean, was McCloskey recruited to Opus Dei there in the early 70s at Morningside, or was he already involved in Opus Dei before he came to the residence?
What we heard through the grapevine was that he was already a numerary of the society upon arriving at Columbia. And he, like many students at Columbia, came from the DC area. Many of my classmates had been at the Opus Dei High School in the Washington area. I'm not sure if CJ was, but he was from that kind of Washington cohort. And we were told that he was already a numerary, which at that age was like quite something.
So the audience member is telling us that McCloskey supposedly was already a quite high-ranking numerary in Opus Dei
At a very young age.
when he arrived at Columbia, and coming from Washington, where the center of Opus Dei was.
And, went on to work for Merrill Lynch and in banking. So again, the idea that he did not go to the priesthood, although later I believe that's kind of the direction, but he really just went out into the world and recruited as Opus Dei basically, encourages its members very actively to proselytize, to bring other recruits in, especially from all these different areas of what they consider to be the elite, as you mentioned, particularly people with money. We see in Washington, D.C., a lot of folks who are in the military. We see it in different branches of the U.S. government, where we've seen the intelligence branches, law enforcement, et cetera. They're really targeting people, and that they begin that grooming very, very early on. And it takes a long, long time sometimes for them to bring them in. And that's why, people may not even be aware that they're being groomed for a long time, which is really the, part of their strength of the way in which they build the membership, and they build these connections. One more comment, yeah?
Yeah, I have two comments.
Two comments coming, okay.
I think the problem here fundamentally is somebody has to rein in the Supreme Court, because it is now the preeminent institution. And it changes laws at its whim. It makes decisions at its whim based on its politics. And if you don't, either by nullification or even by arrest, like Lincoln did with Chief Justice Taney, and issued an arrest warrant, they have to be curbed, and somebody has to do it. And my final comment is—
Let's go ahead.
So the audience member is saying that the first problem is the Supreme Court, which has to be reined in his words, because it's changing laws at whim and doing whatever it wants to do, basically. And your second comment?
My second comment is from Nikita Khrushchev. When your house is on fire, you don't hang around to take out the furniture. Essentially, you put out the fire. And this is an existential moment for the United States, where our house is on fire. And if Donald Trump wins, there will never be an election again.
So the audience member's second point is that a quote from Nikita Khrushchev to say, when the house is on fire, you leave, you don't hang around and take out the furniture. And that this is one of those existential moments where if Trump wins, there won't be another election and we need to do something.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, we are looking to the next, the election in 3 weeks. And one of the things that is going to come up is, of course, many people are quite aware that if you follow Project 2025, if you look at the kinds of agendas that they're putting forward, one really big key piece of it is continuing to follow the judicial agenda that Leonard Leo has been funding in the lower courts. We're going to come out with a package of stories this week that talks about the unfolding agenda. What we're seeing is a very active, hundreds of lawsuits. And the preparation of what Steve Bannon calls this army of folks who are precinct watchers. There's an entire infrastructure that's being funded and mobilized to prevent a fair election. But the goal there, of course, is to punt it up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court can then say, all right, well, we're going to have to vote with the majority. The majority is a Republican majority. Therefore, we're going to say that, after lots and lots of fighting, probably the Republicans have a victory in the Electoral College, and that will happen. Well, that is clearly the agenda. So, of course, our goal will be to talk about this as much as possible. But, on the good side, I think what we're seeing is, as with this Opus Dei book that you've done, which I think is just a terrific piece of work, more people are aware, more people are asking the questions. And we do have a lot of people, even at a level of Congress, like Sheldon Whitehouse, and other, who have been holding hearings on the dark money of Leonard Leo. And I think the more that Americans are aware that our domestic and our foreign policy is being funded by groups who are not known, not elected, not accountable, the more questions will come up, the more that people are getting motivated. So, I remain, of course, always a kind of person who is interested in what are the things that are coming. And so, while we may, be dealing with a moment of the first American populism, what I call a soft coup, it would be a full coup. So many people in America are being mobilized right now. So many people are being politicized because, in fact, when your democracy is threatened, a lot of people suddenly find that they care a lot more than they thought they did about this. And we're seeing this not just in the US, but of course, we're seeing this in France, where they made a last minute kind of coming together to prevent a complete far-right movement. We're seeing this in Germany, although things are looking quite bad. We're seeing this in the Netherlands. In fact, everywhere you have autocratic rule. And I would just end on a hopeful note, which is that in Hungary, which has seen 14 years of an autocracy under Orban, which is the model for Project 2025, there are a lot of lessons. One of them is that while there's been oppression, while they've taken control of the judiciary, while they've stopped a free press, and Orban's put all of his cronies in place, a underground, very broad, very public, democratic opposition has developed to the point where there's now a strong political party called the Freedom and Respect Party, led by Peter Magyar. Orban nearly lost this last election. People predict he may lose the next one. You can't keep truth down. You can't keep people down. So we have a lot of things that we could do. And I hope one of them, Gareth, is going to be continuing to really investigate this story. And I just really want to congratulate you. I want to give you the last word on this in terms of maybe what you're next going to hope to do, and maybe what you would want to leave people with in terms of this book.
What I want to do, I'd love to write another book, but I'm searching for a new idea, I guess. And I'd like for it to be as far removed from Opus Dei as possible. I'm kind of, after 5 years of digging into this, but I'm not, lots of people want me to talk about this, and so I'm not sure I'm going to be able to leave this anytime soon. But I what I want people to take away from this is I guess what I guess I would two things, I guess. One, I want to break the cycle of Opus Dei being able to recruit, especially children, but also, just people in powerful positions who are completely unaware of what this organization really is. But two, I hope that the book opens the eyes of current members, either those supernumeraries who just are unaware of what's going on, but also of the numeraries inside who are trapped in the organization, to give them the confidence to leave and restart their lives. I mean, there's been a lot of kind of dark moments through the research of, hearing these harrowing stories. But what's kind of really raised my spirits is seeing those people who, after living through all of these horrors, have been able to restart their lives. I mean, I remember one of the women I spoke to in Argentina. I visited her in her house, and she got married, she'd had a kid, and just started her life again from scratch, and seemed quite happy. And it is possible. So yeah, I do hope that people are able to break free of this horrendous organization.
Well, we are going to be posting this video on our website, and just to repeat it, it's stopthecoup2025.org. We're a nonpartisan campaign of education and mobilization on Project 2025. And just to say also that Gareth has this in his book, and we'll provide some links on the website. There are organizations of former members of Opus Dei who have started support networks online and a lot of information, so that people can get more information. We encourage people to do so, and of course to continue to be in touch with us. And we of course have to end this with saying, we invite folks to tune into our next broadcast, where we're going to be talking about the unfolding agenda. But we are in no way going to let go of this issue. We're going to continue to report on the connection of the dark money and the influence, and what the right-wing movement and conservative movement is seeking to do in terms of, attacking our democracy. And so I just want to thank you again, Gareth. Best of luck with the book, and inviting people to please pick up the book. It's called Opus, Simon & Schuster. We have some copies here for sale. And, I just wish you all the luck, and congratulations on a wonderful piece of work.
And thank you so much for having me on. Thank you to your live audience there in person, and also the people online. I really appreciate your interest and support. And yes, you can find me on social media if you want to, and happy to engage in conversation and the rest of it. So yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. Revisioning Democracy. We'll see you on October 25th.